Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the July meeting of the Housing, Planning and Environment Overview and Scrutiny Committee. We've got quite a lot on our agenda today, so let's try and keep focused and make our way through it. So we have had apologies for absence from councillors Stott, Booth, Dickman and Preston, and I would like to welcome our substitute this evening, who's Councillor Walker. So thank you very much for being here, Councillor Walker. There are no chair's announcements and no urgent business. Are there any declarations of interest for any of the items on the agenda? No. And the minutes of the last meeting, a member requested a slight amendment just to remove the names from who was proposing and seconding members to be the chair. And so with that amendment, are those minutes agreed? Agreed. Okay, thank you very much. As an action outstanding that won't come up elsewhere on the agenda, an item that was brought up at the last meeting was about the Bury Interchange escalator. TFGM have confirmed that the escalator at Bury Interchange that gives access to Metrolink platforms has now been fixed. Very good. Okay, item 5, rail performance in Greater Manchester and the implementation of the May 2018 timetable improvements. We have a number of guests here to speak to us this evening. I'd like to thank them all very much indeed for coming along. This is an item that I'm sure will have been raised with all members across the whole of the conurbation as an issue that's affecting an awful lot of people. So with us we have Martin Frobisher from Network Rail and Leon Sumpter and Raj Chandarana from Northern. We've also got some officers from TFGM who can help us. Simon is here if we need any guidance on our understanding of the way things work. So thank you very much. Welcome to all of you. We do appreciate your being here. We have got other items on the agenda, and I'm fairly sure we could have taken up several meetings just talking about rail. But I'm keen that we look forwards into where things are going in the future, and I think how this is being resolved. But I think to do that, we need to understand some of what has happened. We members have received what I thought was actually a really useful briefing from officers explaining about the situation and how we've got to where we've got to with rail. I wonder, I'm going to invite you, if you did want to say a couple of minutes, and I will press that couple of minutes, if you did want to make any opening remarks at all, or we can just jump into questions, I'm open to that. Mr. Frobisher.
Okay, well, from my point of view, I think I'd like to start with an apology. Really, I'm sorry for the difficulties that this has caused for yourselves and the people who you represent. I live in the north and have really seen the impact of this amongst friends and family. So really genuinely sorry for the impact that we, Network Rail, have contributed to this. I guess in the overall context for us, it's part of the Great North Rail project. We're building a vast scheme across the north, and I really genuinely believe that the improvements in infrastructure are needed. So it's been a really complex scheme, it's been really difficult, but really genuinely believe that the extra infrastructure that we are building is absolutely essential. And we can go through the details of what's happened in a moment, but really sorry for what's happened, and in the context, really genuinely believe the infrastructure is needed.
Thank you for that. Does anybody from Northern want to say a couple of minutes on before we get into questions?
Yeah, I'd like to echo that apology from Network Rail. On behalf of Northern, we are genuinely sorry for the disruption that the timetable change caused for the people of Greater Manchester, and indeed anybody wanting to travel into Greater Manchester from further afield. Like Martin, I live in the north. In fact, I live about a 3-minute walk away from this very building, and I've seen the impact on not only my staff but on commuters that I engage with regularly. It's a very difficult time for commuters, and I'm very sorry that between us, Northern Network Rail have contributed towards that. So I won't say anything more about the reasons why, but I'm happy to answer any questions as they come up.
Thank you very much for that. One of the questions I asked my residents what they'd like me to ask you, and there were some route-specific questions that we might get to later. But a more general question is about the impact of underperformance, because timetable changes led to some stark examples of underperformance. but before that, considerably before that, there were challenges in meeting what was expected of the service. And I wonder if you could explain what the impact on you is of underperformance. Specifically, are you fined for underperformance or for not meeting targets? Because there have been a number of targets that have not been met.
Okay. We have, at Northern, we have a franchise agreement with Rail North Partnership and with the Department for Transport, which specifies within it a series of targets that range from performance-related targets, I think you're referring to, but also across multiple different parts of the franchise agreement, including the number of services we need to run on certain lines of route. Is quite prescriptive and covering things as far as wide-ranging as things like diversity targets. Within the franchise agreement, there are a series of measures that enable our client to take action against us if we fail to hit those targets. When it comes to train performance in particular, there's a mechanism within the franchise agreement which forces us to, rather than pay a direct fine, it forces us to contribute towards a pot for reinvesting what would be a fine back into the network to improve performance. And there's some very strict rules around what we can and can't invest that in, and it have to be directly to improve performance where we've contributed to its failings. And we have that ongoing dialogue with the client, and they need to approve each and every scheme that we suggest implementing.
And perhaps, could I add to that for Network Rail? So if Network Rail causes a delay to a train, then yes, we pay compensation to the operators through the track access contract mechanism. If one of our projects gets into difficulty and we take more time and disrupt more trains whilst we're building it, likewise we pay more compensation in that scenario. And it's also worth mentioning that the compensation package, which has recently been announced by Transport for the North, is funded by the rail industry.
And that's the one for people who hold season tickets. Is that the one you're referring to?
Yes, and I think that's really for Transport for the North to work through the detail with their members.
So one of the things that I have struggled to get my head around is if you were to cancel a train, so a train that is supposed to depart on a particular time in a particular direction, and that's cancelled, how much does that cost to you, not to the people who are supposed to be getting the train?
Okay, there is for every, the way that it works is there is a cost associated with every single minute in which a train is delayed. So there is an amount that we have to put into this this part of the franchise agreement, which requires us to reinvest for every single minute that we delay a train. And if the delay is due to a Network Rail cause or an external cause outside of our control, then Network Rail will pay an amount for every minute that comes to us, and that varies by operator, often varies by line of route as well. And that ranges from the tens of pounds for a minute to hundreds of pounds for every single minute. When it comes to cancellations, there's another formula which again varies depending on the class of train that do it, and that tends to be in the hundreds to the low thousands of pounds depending on the specific class of train.
If I just add to the responses you've heard, the real ultimate cost to us, the company and the rail industry, and probably to everybody, is that when we have unreliable services that are cancelled, people choose to opt out of using rail. And unlike in London, where there are lots of other public transport alternatives, like you can tell by my accent, I'm from London originally. I live in Manchester now and have done for the last 4 years. What you end up getting is the choice is train or car. And so we see passenger numbers declining, congestion rising. So our aim is to have more services, more passengers, therefore more income, of which we can then reinvest into rail. Clearly, if we're not trusted to run the rail service, if we're not running a reliable service, people opt out and they choose the cars. So that is the ultimate cost to us. It's about losing customers.
Councillor Winstanley first.
I'm on now. Sorry, thank you. I think one of the most disappointing aspects of this is that we was on the threshold of a really, really positive, bold, new expansion of the railways, you know, loads of new services, loads of new trains coming on. And I use the railways a lot, and that's been the most disappointing part of it. And I accept that things go wrong and, you know, these things will always happen and inevitably there will be delays. But I think it was the communication around it and the way that you handled it. It was seemed to be that no one was accepting responsibility for what had gone wrong. Northern were saying it was Network Rail were saying it was Northern. And actually, from an outsider looking in, it just looked like a total and utter shambles. And all right, we've got to accept what happened, but it's moving forward now. So obviously we've got the emergency timetable in. When do you expect that to move to a normalised timetable? But also, what have you put in for future to make sure that you don't get into this situation again? Because I'm not one for harking back to what happened previously. I'd rather look at, okay, what can we do moving forward to make sure that we don't get in this situation again, and that the communications and public relations with passengers and the public is a lot better and a lot slicker, and we've got proper communications.
Okay. Can I just start by saying Network Rail is not blaming Northern. You know, there is no doubt that we have contributed to this problem. So we've been building major schemes. In this area, the biggest scheme, of course, is the Manchester to Preston through Bolton electrification scheme. We've had real difficulties with that scheme, with really difficult ground conditions. We dig a hole and sand runs into it, and ancient mine workings which are uncharted underneath the ground. We had some real practical difficulties which triggered many of these problems. And there's no question about that. We have contributed. It's a huge scheme. It's hugely complex. It'll make a big difference in the long run. But we've had some practical difficulties, and we have contributed. And I'm not blaming Northern for that. I mean, that's a fact. Yeah, we'll get there. And when it's done, it's going to be fabulous. Perhaps Liam's probably better able to answer the timetable question, which I think was the specific question. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd also like to point out that I don't think Northern was seeking to blame Network Rail for what happened, but because we recognise that these are incredibly complicated infrastructure projects, and the winter that we've just been through has some extreme weather in it that must have made it incredibly difficult for that project to complete on time. And I think there's a genuine passion, because you spoke, Councillor, about being on the cusp of some real great improvements to the rail industry. There's a passion for trying to make those things happen as quickly as is almost humanly possible. So there's certainly an optimism and a real challenge to get those things done quickly. The fact that the project ran into difficulties at the last minute due to the infrastructure issues that Martin alluded to, that did contribute towards the lack of time we had to develop a timetable, which in turn resulted in the challenges in those towards the end of May and into June. We didn't know until days before that timetable change, sort of the scale of how challenging it was going to be. We were aware that there were going to be some service reductions in some locations. They were planned because we weren't able to run electric trains as we had hoped to on the Bolton corridor. So we were aware there were going to be some service reductions, and in fact we did a structured communications plan with the good people of Levenshulme and Heaton Chapel and Woodsmore and Davenport, stations that were particularly affected by those service reductions. We had members of my senior management team all deployed on the platforms in those weeks after the timetable, ready to go effectively, and to explain to passengers why the timetable wasn't what they wanted it to be. But it was only in those last few days before the change itself that we started to get an appreciation for how detrimental that change would be for the base performance. So I think you're right in that we didn't communicate what the challenge was going to be, but I can honestly say we didn't know until it was very, very late in proceedings. As soon as the timetable changed and the scale of the problems came to light, we immediately put into place a contingency plan, which was the introduction of the interim timetable that you also mentioned. That interim timetable took out a relatively small number of services, considering what Northern normal run on a day-to-day basis, but it took out enough services to enable us to let the timetable breathe, to let performance start to restabilise, and to enable us to carry on with and deliver our training plan for drivers and conductors. That started 2 weeks after the timetable change, so on June the 4th, and is still in operation today. That was always due to run as an interim timetable until July the 29th, because that's the end of the Liverpool blockade, when we have to make some changes anyway, when Martin's team finish another part of the Great North Rail project. We are currently working out, right now, it's a very live issue, and I was on a phone conference talking about it until 15 minutes before this session started, about to what extent we can feel confident with the reintroduction of all of those services that we took out, because I think it's really important that we offer people of Greater Manchester a form of stability. So it would be inappropriate of us to reintroduce services if we're not confident that we can do that in a stable fashion. And we're working through that with Network Rail and with Transpennine Express, with the other operator, that have a particular impact on the Manchester core. And that's a live process. So some services will start to be reintroduced, and in the coming days we will work out how many of those services are going to start coming in. Okay.
Councillor Gunther. You had indicated before that you wanted to speak, I think, didn't you? Me? You, yes.
Sorry, I was studying this. I have to apologise. I didn't hear what you said.
Sorry, I just called you to speak because I thought I'd seen you earlier indicate that you had a question.
No, the only question I would like to have would be the escalator in Bury Interchange, and that has been resolved, hopefully permanently. Yeah, hopefully.
Lovely, thank you very much. Councillor Wilson.
I mean, from the constituents of the communities that we represent around this table, it's been a very, very frustrating time. The succession of emergency and interim timetables doesn't really seem to have given much confidence back for rail users. I guess really is what I'm asking is when can we expect to see what most of our residents will describe as a decent level of service? Because I mean, I think even after the interim timetable, I think we're still seem to be some way off that. We're still seeing delays and cancellations. So I mean, what are the timescales for that?
So if I start with explaining a little bit about some of the numbers involved. When the May timetable was launched on May the 21st, the number of cancellations associated with a lack of train crew, which was really not being able to match train crew to their diagrams and to the timetable, but I won't get into too much of that complexity. The number of cancellations associated with that were in the hundreds of cancellations. We were cancelling between 200 and 300 services a day because of that reason. The interim timetable that started on June the 4th dropped that dramatically to single figures of cancellations within a couple of days of it being in place. So the number of cancellations, and they're the services that are severely disrupted effectively. I think they're the most frustrating for passengers when the service is cancelled or significantly late. So that dropped off very quickly. The other measure that sort of dictates to what extent we're able to deliver a robust train service is what we call PPM, is public performance measure, and that's the percentage of trains that operate, arrive at their destination within 5 minutes of the published time. The public performance measure dropped to in the mid-70s, so around 70% of services across the whole of the north during those first 2 weeks after the timetable change, with some days considerably below that. But following the introduction of the interim timetable, that has also jumped back up to what I'm going to say is relatively consistent mid-80s performance. So we're talking around 83 to 85% of trains hitting their PPM every single day across the whole of the north. Now, there are some factors that have affected our ability to consistently deliver that level of performance. Most notably, the unseasonable and very pleasant hot weather we've been having, that has pushed rail temperatures to the levels that we just do not consistently see in the UK, particularly over that length of time, and that has caused the infrastructure a number of challenges, as I'm sure you can appreciate, and has been well publicised. I think that's hampered our ability to get that number back to consistently 85% and above. Since the moment the interim timetable was introduced, we've been working with Network Rail and with TransPennine on a performance improvement plan, which will start to push that measure to greater levels based on the things that changed in the May timetable. And one of the big changes in the May timetable that affects performance is the repathing of TransPennine services from the south side of Manchester into the north side of Manchester when they're coming from Leeds and east of the Pennines. So if you're familiar with the service, most services used to come from Leeds, go to Stalybridge, and then effectively turn left at Stalybridge and head to Piccadilly. Now they'll sort of turn right and they go to Victoria and they follow the Ordsall cord around through the Castlefield corridor and into Piccadilly from that way round. When those services come across the Pennines with a little bit of delay, that is causing delay to every single line of route that then interacts with those services around the Manchester core. It's a very good solution to use the Ordsall cord. It was put there for a reason, to improve capacity, but we're still working our way through the performance implications of that. So our performance improvement plan, as I said, in conjunction with Martin's team and our colleagues at TransPennine Express, focuses on issues such as how do we improve the Manchester core now that the TransPennine services operate in them. That is an ongoing dialogue, and there are a number of other work streams that look at trying to maximise. It's almost getting every bead of sweat out of the infrastructure we possibly can to keep as many services running as we can and to get as higher capacities as possible. We are delivering a more consistent and a better level of performance every day. It's just that they're small numbers and they're small gains. Some of these complex operational issues do take a long time for us to work through, but I'm hoping that constituents will start to see some more consistent level of performance in the coming days and weeks. It is that sort of iterative. It will happen in that sort of way.
I've got Councillor Morgan and then Councillor Sadler, please.
Thank you, Chair. It's a question about the electrification programme. Obviously, I represent Bolton, and we've been quite affected by the link up to Preston. There was also supposed to be a spire off from Lostock connecting on electrifying up to Wigan that seems to have come to a grinding halt, and there are rumours it's been cancelled. Can anybody comment on that, whether that's going to be completed or not?
Okay, so that scheme we've been doing feasibility studies on. We've provided some information to Department for Transport of what the scheme would cost, and I think it's under review as to whether or not that can be funded, given the cost of the scheme and the benefits it brings. So that's we've provided costing information to Department for Transport, and they have it under consideration.
On from that, then, could we have a timescale for when the decision will be made, do you think, or it could be whatever?
So I don't know the answer to that question. We've provided the information, but I think at this moment in time, there is not government funding for the cost of the full scheme, I think is the scenario that we've got. Yeah.
Councillor Sadler, please.
Yes, thank you for the report. Why is it cheaper to cancel a train than to run a train late? And do we have a figure of how much has gone into the infrastructure from fines that have been made because trains are late? And you said before about the lack of crew. Are you recruiting new crew members?
Okay, thank you for the questions. First of all, it's not cheaper to delay a service than to cancel a service, or vice versa. And even if it is, the fine is completely irrelevant to any operational decision we would ever make on the day. Northern will never make a decision to cancel or to delay a train ever on the basis of how much that might cost us in a fine. It's just simply not how we do things. We always try and deliver the maximum beneficial output to the passengers. In terms of how much money is reinvested into improving the network, I don't have those figures to hand, but I don't know what those numbers would be. I would describe it as significant, but it would be very difficult for me to put anything more sort of exact into it than that. And then finally, the question on lack of crew. I think there's a misconception here that there are insufficient crew to deliver the service that Northern would like to operate as part of the May timetable. That is simply not the case. Every single depot in Greater Manchester and beyond has sufficient number of crew to run the timetable that they require. The reason it became a challenge, and the reason I sort of mentioned that there are train crew associated delays, are that because of the late notification that the timetable was going to have to change, it meant that we were building a timetable in which we have to change 90% of our services in 16 weeks. Ordinarily, that timetable would be changing 20% of our services, and we would have 40 weeks to do it. So the quality control measures and the back end of the processes all became incredibly condensed because of that late notification of that requirement, which came as a result of the notification that the project wasn't going to be complete on time. So fast forward into April sort of time, at that stage we're starting to match the requirements at each specific depot for what they're going to have to do to run the train service. Ordinarily, what we thought was going to happen is that the Bolton line would be electrified, and therefore we were training our drivers to be able to drive electric trains on that particular line of route. When we were notified that wasn't going to be the case, you have to rebuild the whole timetable, and then we have to allocate work to drivers across the whole of the several Northwest depots, of which there are I'm going to say something about maybe 1,000 drivers or something, maybe slightly less, maybe 800 drivers, each one with sort of a different work pack than was anticipated, and we had to retrain them effectively at very, very short notice. And that training requirement was effectively too great for us to manage in the very short amount of time that remained. So it was never a case of not having enough drivers, it was a case of not having had the time to train them in the specific type of work they were going to need to do in readiness for May. And to give you a sort of an idea, it takes between a year and 18 months to train a train driver. It's a very, very safety critical, important job, and the way a lot of that training requires the driver to be trained on every single specific route they're going to operate, and all drivers will operate on multiple routes across the Northwest. Each route takes between 5 and 7 days of training on. Each different train they drive, and we've got 6 or 7 different types of train, requires a significant amount of training as well. If they drive diesel trains normally, then training them to drive an electric train is a big difference, and that's 2 or 3 weeks, maybe more, of additional training. So it was a case of, in March, April, beginning to realise that we were going to need to train drivers for things that we'd never envisaged having to train them for, and not having had the time to do it. So definitely got enough drivers. We've been recruiting from the start of the franchise, and we'll continue to recruit. We always over-recruit, so we've always got spares, but we just ran out of time to complete the training on time.
You mentioned, before I bring in Councillor Walker, you mentioned that you didn't have to hand the figure that Northern had to put into the pot because of delays and cancellations. Please, could you send that in, because that information will exist. I understand you might not have it to hand, but it would be useful for the committee to know that number. Thank you very much. Councillor Walker.
Yes. Going back to the point that this gentleman made about future route use of railways, because one of the things, if people design their lives around public transport, they buy houses based on how they can commute to the main areas of business. So I happen to live in an authority, as many of us do, that has mainly got commuters in it rather than homegrown jobs. So it's not easy for us to switch on and off. So the switching on and off really meant, in many cases, massive queues, traffic problems and the like. But I just wonder, and I recognise that people, to some extent, have to come back in the short term. In the longer term, they think about, actually, I'm not going to buy a house which requires commuting. You know, I won't go for that job. But in the short term, I just wonder, since we've come back to near normality, what the statistics are telling us about usage. You know, are we down, and if so, how much on our regular users? Because I've got people who already have, you know, started, those that can, have tried to make alternative arrangements. Sometimes it might benefit our bus services. So we happen to have the V1 and V2, and I'm quite sure that several people started thinking, well, actually, that's not, so that might be a plus for Greater Manchester. But in the main, what we are talking about, you know, just throwing more and more people on the roads, and almost all our planning is the opposite to that. So I'm just wondering about these statistics for usage now.
Okay. In the immediate aftermath of the timetable change, we saw a significant reduction in the number of people using the services, as you might expect, and I'm sure there is anecdotal evidence, if not more evidence, of roads becoming even more congested as people decided not to take the risk. And once again, you know, we apologise for people having to do that, because we do recognise, I recognise that people having to change their daily routine to do something that might be more expensive or just as stressful driving or something like that is not in any way a good thing for people to have to do. So our role, effectively, after those first 2 weeks with the interim timetable, was to try and introduce some stability, to try and give people a little more comfort. And we've absolutely seen passenger numbers rebound across large parts of the northwest, where it continues to be a challenge in terms of passenger numbers. Are locations where I think there remains a negativity around the robustness of the service. I think particularly with media and public figures making statements saying that the railway isn't working, that's a challenge to attract people back to the railway in those circumstances. But it's our job to continue to improve the quality of the service, to provide something that is more robust, more stable, and to continue with our investment programme. Because if you remember, our franchise was launched with a fanfare of all the things we're going to do, hundreds or thousands of new services a week, brand new trains, improvements at stations, and all of that work is ongoing, and it's important that we continue to stay true to that and continue to deliver it. And with Martin's support, who's delivering the Great North Rail project in terms of the infrastructure upgrades, it's important those two things continue in order to give people confidence in and a desire to use our services again. So the answer to the question is we have seen a drop-off. Those numbers are starting to come back in the majority of locations, but still in some locations we're yet to see a full rebound in the number of services.
Okay. And then a question. And this is following on from the point you were making about the electrification and the feasibility study you did from Bolton to Wigan. We're politicians around this table, and we're very conscious of the fact that the North doesn't seem to get a fair deal. And I'm just looking for, I mean, it's difficult for you, but we want to put pressure on for that feasibility study to become a reality. And I'm trying to get a steer for what would be the most influential way for that. It might not be something that you're particularly aware of, but you know, but you know what hurts you most, because what hurts seems to get results.
Okay, so if we just start by saying that we are making vast investments across the north. You know, as Liam said, this Great North Rail project delivers 2,000 extra trains per week. That's the scope and extent of the project. And it's much of it's already built. You know, the Ordsall Chord is a fabulous piece of engineering. We've got new platforms at Manchester Airport. Manchester Victoria Station's been upgraded. We've now got the electrified route to Blackpool. We're just in the final stages of finishing the Liverpool scheme, which will improve the services between Liverpool and Manchester. There is a lot of this that is already in the ground. I'm with you on building this and winning new investment for the North. The North needs it. For me, I'm just loving what we're doing. We're driving tunnels through hillsides in Farnworth. We're doing, you know, what the Victorians did. I would like to win the business case for new schemes, but some of them are difficult. So these electrification projects, it's not about wires. They're big civil engineering projects. A train with a pantograph on top of it needs more space than a diesel train. So it's about raising bridges, digging tunnels, and it's massive civil engineering. Now the line that you're referring to is it's got lots of bridges on it, all of which would need rebuilding, and also bear in mind that that would have traffic implications locally whilst we demolish and rebuild those bridges. So it's a scheme that is when you look at the full civil engineering, it's over £40 million in the costings that we've provided to Department for Transport. It's a vast civil engineering scheme, and they're considering the relative merits of the business case. Yeah.
I don't think you'd expect to hear much disagreement about encouraging investment in the rail in the North in this room. I think I would like to say that all of us in this room are broadly in favour of it. I think it's fair to say. Unanimous. Thank you, Councillor Robinson. Absolutely right. I'm going to ask Simon if he wants to make any comments, and then I'll talk to you about it would be remiss of me as a ward councillor not to ask you why my peak time services are 2 carriages, not 4. But Simon, do you want to?
Certainly. I mean, I suppose observations from Transport for Greater Manchester. Firstly, I think our observation would be that the rail industry has definitely learned a lesson as a result of the exercise that it's been through recently, and we have seen the partners who are here and the agencies that they represent looking to work very hard with ourselves and Transport for the North to try and put these issues right. It's also caused us to look at whether we have the right arrangements in place between the Northern Transport Authorities to give good governance to the franchising process, and there is a review underway which is being led jointly by the leader of Leeds City Council on behalf of the Northern Authorities and Joe Johnson, the Transport Minister, to review the entire governance system around Rail North to ensure that Northern Authorities are well sighted early in a franchise planning process around any such issues if they arise again. So I think this is an exercise that's caused every agency to revisit and fully understand the implications for exactly the reasons that Councillor Walker highlights in particular. You know, let's look at what we've achieved in Greater Manchester over the past 20 years. We have at least doubled the performance of rail commuting, particularly into the regional centre, and without that, frankly, we wouldn't have achieved some of the economic growth that we've seen. So we have to be able to get ourselves back on that path as quickly as possible. Our growth plans in each of our key centres are very heavily predicated on a strong rail offer. I think all parties get that now. I think we're working better in terms of the long term, and I think we're also now starting to work better in terms of how we inform the travelling public as the issues come up. So we have, for example, seen a certain amount of switch across to parallel Metrolink lines, to parallel bus lines, and we're trying to make sure that the best information's out there in the interim so that passengers can take those choices. And so that we help passengers across from one mode to another while we take ourselves through this period. So it's been painful. I think they're working very hard to put it right. I don't think they're going to put it right immediately. And I think we're working hard at the moment to make sure that elected members and commuters can understand why that's the case and what they can realistically expect over time. And I think it was a very sensible decision for the rail industry to decide that that they weren't going to go for significant additional changes in December, because I think what the rail system needs now is a period of calm in order to put itself right, and then we build from here. So hopefully members have found the discussion that you've had useful in terms of getting a little bit more insight into why these things have happened and how seriously they're being treated.
Councillor Holland, I think I must have missed you earlier. You wanted to come in.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, as Vice Chair of Metrolink and Rail Network for TFG, I can reassure the members of this committee that they are scrutinised really highly. We do put them through the tasks when we have our meetings, and they do attend meetings. Every meeting we have, there's somebody from the operators do turn up, and we do put them through, you know, on performances or whatever. So I just want to reassure members from this committee.
Thank you for that. And Councillor Sadler. Thank you, Councillor Holland.
Yeah, just a very quick one. You said about extra trains, extra stock. Will that be new stock, or will it be older stock brought in from other authorities?
Okay. As part of the Northern's transformation programme, we're introducing 98 brand new trains. They are well through the building process. In fact, the first one is currently in a depot around 20 miles away from here, getting the once over from our engineers. They're going to continue to arrive throughout the course of the back part of this year and all the way through next year. The building programme's on schedule, and they're a very, very high quality train. So it's 98 trains. It's amounts to 289 carriages in total, all brand new, purpose built for the north. In addition to that, we are bringing in carriages from other parts of the rail network if they don't need them anymore, particularly where they've had parts of their network electrified and we can still use them here. So we sort of try and grab every spare carriage we possibly can, because we know capacity is such a challenge in the north, and we'll continue to do that to try and provide the best level of capacity.
Councillor Gunther.
It's worth adding that you're phasing out all the old Pacer trains, aren't you? And that is one of the key commitments of the wider Great North Rail project, because those things are well past their life, and I think that'll be a real step change for the region.
If I could just add one more thing, which is more practical for this committee, I'm looking to take key stakeholders to go and look at the new trains, the new stock that are coming, and I'm very happy to make an arrangement for this committee to go and see some of the new stock that we're going to be bringing into service, hopefully from early next year. So if you want me to arrange that, I'm very happy to work with the committee.
Thank you very much for that invitation. If you want to see Pacers, come to my ward. Councillor Gunther.
Okay, I press this now?
You're on.
Okay, thank you very much. If I could just ask a question of Mr. Warburton, Simon, or whatever. I don't know how formal you are or informal you are, yeah. It's just a question. I think you said in the past 20 years, the rail commuting public has increased by 50%. Anyway, how much of it is attributable to Metrolink as opposed to Network Rail?
So across the piece, we've managed to get to a position now where commuting into Manchester city centre in the morning peak is 70% non-car. The greatest single contributors to that shift have been the rail, the heavy rail growth and Metrolink growth, and we've seen roughly a doubling of both modes in terms of the proportion of commuters that they're now carrying into the city centre compared to 20 years ago.
Yeah, again, and just as an aside to that question, I'm sorry. So has the greater emphasis been on Network Rail or on Metrolink?
I think that the reality is both. So what we've seen is that where we've seen investment in a rail solution in particular for travel into the city centre, whether it's a heavy rail solution, a Northern Trains service or a Transpennine service, or whether it's Metrolink, people have responded. And the central point now is that we've got to maintain that quality going forwards, and I think that's the message really that's come out of this episode.
Thank you very much. I think to start with an apology was the right place to start, because you will know as well as we know as ward councillors the distress, upset, challenges that this has brought to people's lives, family life, commuting life. And it's good to hear an acknowledgement of the issues and some discussion about where things go forwards. I think that getting the trains to run on time is part of your job, but communicating with passengers as well, and I think it's been made by a couple of members around the table about what is going to happen when timetable changes happen, but also what's happening when you're standing on the platform and it says there's a train there and there is no train there. That is a real challenge for people. Getting the rail network working properly interlinks, as Simon says, with so many other things that we need to do in Greater Manchester, talking about congestion, talking about air quality, where do we build the homes that we need, and your job in that is really important. I look forward to receiving the figures that we talked about that you didn't have to hand. I think that would be useful information for passengers. And please, can we have a 4-carriage train on the line to and from Romiley and Marple in peak times and not a 2-carriage train? All right, thank you very much for coming. We will move on then. As the member, as the ward member, as the person who came here on a Northern train from Romiley this evening, Councillor Walker, yes, I declare an interest. Okay, thank you very much. You're welcome to stay, but please don't feel obliged to do so. More transport, but active modes, walking and cycling. Simon.
Yes, thank you, Chair. So members may well be aware from the media in particular that we've seen quite a spike in interest and activity around cycling and walking in Greater Manchester over the past 12 months, stimulated in no small part by the appointment of Chris Boardman as Greater Manchester Cycling and Walking Commissioner. So what we've set out in the report here is a summary of how we've been working with Chris and his advisors over the past year to look to develop the vision for cycling that he set out in his initial publication, Made to Move, and now to start to translate that into a strategy for a future network, which has been termed the B-Lines network. What the report sets out is what Chris is looking to achieve through his approach, how we are working with him to ensure that we aren't planning cycling in splendid isolation from the other demands on our highway system, and that's the approach that we're taking through the Streets for All strategy that's discussed in the report, making sure that we understand the competing demands for highway space in each part of Greater Manchester and how we strike the right balance between promoting the use of active modes whilst also making sure that we can still manage the needs of general traffic around the conurbation, the needs of freight traffic around the conurbation, and of course protecting the performance of our bus system as well across the highways network. We have a capital programme of activities already underway across Greater Manchester, and through the confirmation of the Mayor's £160 million Cycling and Walking Fund, we're now working with local authorities to bring forward a future tranche of investment over the next 4 years that will add further value to the capital programme that's been in delivery over recent years. I'm happy to take any questions, Jess.
Sorry, you could see my questioning face there. That was my first question, because it all sounds very exciting, very interesting. I think all of us would agree that investing in cycling and walking is a very good, sensible thing to do. Talks about £1.5 billion over the next 10 years. £160 million has been found and provided. You talked about bringing forwards some money, or getting some money for the next 4 years. Where's that money from? Sorry, I missed that bit.
No, not at all. Apologies, Chair. I probably didn't explain it very, very clearly. So we've set aside £160 million of funding that was received from government through an allocation to Greater Manchester from what was called the Transforming Cities Fund. That £160 million is not yet allocated to specific schemes. We now have a development process underway, which we're working on with the 10 authorities, to bring forward programmes of initiatives that we will then agree allocations from the £160 million. The £1.5 billion that Chris has set out in Made to Move is his ambitious target that he has set for Greater Manchester in terms of spending on a future cycling and walking network for Greater Manchester. That is a significant number. For example, we've just recently spent probably around £2 billion in total on the expansion of the Metrolink network, to give you some context in terms of the level of that ambition. The Mayor's Cycling and Walking Fund provides, if you like, the first element of the build towards that type of level of ambition.
Thank you very much. Councillor Gunther.
This programme is certainly to be welcomed as a keen walker. Certainly not a cyclist, but as a keen walker. This programme, it's very ambitious, but it's certainly to be welcomed. However, a strategy is one thing, but the practicalities of the strategy are in my opinion, very, very different. And what part of the problem, as I see it, would be actually behaviour. And that is behaviour of cyclists, behaviour of the general public. And also the safety. It really never ceases to amaze me, and I think I'm right. I don't think many cycles are fitted with bells anymore, are they? I know I go on walking trails, and before I know where I am, I've got a bike right on my heels, sort of thing. So it's really safety, and also the condition of the roads. We're all aware of the number of potholes around. Well, potholes, actually, we recently had a cyclist killed in Bury because of a pothole. So I would just like to highlight the practicalities of the situation, although certainly not criticising the scheme. And I'm just looking, right, GM 2040, is that the year 2040? I think I'll be under the sun. I think I'll be well gone by then. I certainly don't think I'll be cycling.
Simon, would you like to respond to that?
Certainly. So there's two sets of issues there. Let me take them in reverse order. So the 2040 strategy was the long-term transport strategy that the Combined Authority agreed in February 2017. Why is it all the way out to 2040? It's all the way out to 2040 because we know that we have some very big transport milestones on the horizon for Greater Manchester. So if high-speed rail is arriving in the 2030s, we need to plan out transport right through the 2030s to capitalise on those sorts of opportunities. That doesn't mean that we're necessarily setting out every cycle path all the way through to 2040. Clearly, cycling and walking is an element of transport infrastructure that we can plan much more immediately. The observations that Councillor Gunter makes around the application of a cycling plan are absolutely right. What we have found over recent years is that through challenges in terms of maintaining the quality of the highway network, and also at times through a combination of poor driver behaviour and also a lack of confidence quite often amongst certain cyclists, we find cyclists in the wrong place on the highway. And that's clearly not the way that we want to go about organising a cycle plan for Greater Manchester. So through having confidence in terms of funding that we can put into the highway system so that we can maintain the assets considerably better, we can encourage cyclists to find themselves on the right part of the highway. And certainly if you look at the measures, for example, that have been introduced in recent times along the Oxford Road corridor in Manchester, what we've seen is a piece of highway that used to have cycles travelling in quite an erratic fashion around the corridor, cyclists quite often feeling intimidated by buses and therefore behaving in quite a defensive manner. Now what we have is a well-organised piece of highway where cyclists feel safe, and therefore there's a much more orderly arrangement for cycling through that corridor, and we'd like to be able to achieve those sorts of outcomes more widely around the system, so that we can encourage cycling, but in a way that doesn't mean that pedestrians then, for example, feel threatened walking around the highway.
Thank you. I've got Councillor Winstanley, then Councillor Morgan, please.
Thank you, Chair. Well, hopefully I will be here in 2040 to see the strategy through to its conclusion. I just wanted to pick up a couple of points on the 15 steps on the Made to Move document that we've been given. And the goal starts off with a very, good soundbite to double and double again, cycling in Greater Manchester. Now, forgive me if I've missed it within the report, because it was quite detailed, in terms of what's the baseline, how are we measuring what's going to be double and double again, and what's the time scale of that? Because what I'm concerned about with a lot of these things, and pardon the pun, they need to be smart in terms of, we need to be measurable, we need to be realistic, what are the time scales? Because we see tons of these documents, don't we, that make grand sort of like statements, but in terms of actually monitoring and making sure they come through to fulfilment, how are we going to do that, and what's going to be the mechanism for monitoring that? And my second point, again on the 15 steps, I think it's step 10 that talks about call for devolved powers to enforce moving traffic offences and develop strategies for reducing antisocial driving. Now, I know we do have antisocial drivers, but we do have antisocial cyclists as well. And I think we do also need to address that. We can't just pretend that doesn't exist, and we need to have a balanced approach to this. And what I'm concerned about is that perhaps some of the language appears to be anti-motorist, and I'm sure it's not meant to come across in that way, but it can do that, and as though all cyclists are paragons of virtue and all the rest of it and are saving the world. So we just need a balance to it.
Absolutely. Again, to take the comments in reverse order. Chris, as a cycling and walking champion, has set out a particular rhetoric, if you like, that fits with his role, looking to champion the desires of both current cyclists and pedestrians around Greater Manchester, and also a future growing cohort of cyclists and pedestrians. What we're now doing through the work that I described before under the Streets for All approach is then to strike the right balance between the needs of each different highway user across Greater Manchester, because clearly what we aren't looking to do here is to take an anti-car view, or indeed take any individual modal view, but instead strike the right balance across different corridors within the conurbation. In terms of double and double again, cycling accounts for about 2% of journeys to work at the moment in Greater Manchester. So double and double again looks like 8%. And the target that we set through a strategy that we termed Velo City is for us to achieve that outcome by 2025. So that's the target deadline that we're working towards.
Councillor Morgan, please.
Thank you, Chair. You both touched on it slightly, really, because the feedback I've had from the big grand announcement has been the concern that it does look very anti-motorist. And most of us represent inner wards that are built on single lane roads, butted against the footpath, butted against a house or a shop. So how realistic, really, is it that we can expect no effect on to the motorist, obviously, that is still paying the road tax and funding what will be this scheme? So that's my question. And the other question is, once we've got these wonderful cycle lanes into place, who's going to be responsible for maintaining them and keeping them because we don't have enough money to do the roads?
Firstly, in terms of striking that right balance, I think there are two aspects to bear in mind in particular. So firstly, what we're looking to take is a corridor approach. So let's not think about any particular piece of highway in isolation. Let's think about parallel pieces of routing and how we can go about helping to organise traffic in a rational way across the different corridors. So again, to go back to the example in the city centre here around Oxford Road, what we looked to do there was to calm the traffic environment through Oxford Road itself and promote active travel and public transport in particular, because that fitted well with the nature of that particular street. But in parallel, we've also brought in improved traffic flow measures on Upper Brook Street so that we don't impede car drivers looking to pass through that corridor, and we introduced improved delivery arrangements on Cambridge Street on the other side of the Oxford Road corridor so that we could make sure that the logistics suppliers, taxi operators, etc., could also serve the corridor well. And it's about taking that balanced approach across the piece. I think the other important element to bear in mind is there are a very high proportion of car trips in Greater Manchester that are on very short distances. If we're able to encourage people to take that short trip round the corner to the shop by bike or walking, we can take a significant proportion of those short journeys off the road. That's a benefit for car drivers because we're taking the short trips off the road and we're freeing up the highway capacity for journeys that are where the alternative may not be quite so apparent. We're addressing some of the air quality problems that we have in our neighbourhoods, and we address some of the road safety problems that we have in our neighbourhoods. And I think if we take that right balanced approach, then we end up achieving the outcomes that I think all local authorities are looking for in Greater Manchester.
Councillor Robinson.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to be devil's advocate now. I'm not happy. I'm not a happy bunny at all. Along the way, the things that have happened, especially in my ward, we've got a long corridor where the cycling lane's been put down both sides, all the way even past houses, where we have a very seriously ill disabled person who has equipment coming in on a daily basis. Couldn't even get to the front gate because the workmen doing the cycle lanes had blocked it all off. On top of that, I'm disabled myself. This has caused my own untold problems trying to get across some of these roads as a disabled person, needless to say, and on Oxford Road. How are you looking at protecting some of this so that disabled people can cross the road safely instead of having to walk miles up the road before they feel safe to cross the road? But also, how often do you talk to the workmen doing this work on the roads themselves? Because some of their attitude stinks, and the fact that we have to call our leader in and somebody from Manchester to go and sort this problem they'd done on this particular road. And I'm talking near Junction 19 of Haywood. Please, thank you.
So there are standards and expectations in the public contracts that we let around considerate construction standards, and if there are particular issues that arise, then I can only encourage councillors to raise those issues in the way that Councillor Robinson has done there. It is not the intention of TFGM, and I know it's not the intention of our colleagues in local authority highways departments to have contractors working on our projects that are not considerate neighbours whilst working in neighbourhoods. So I can only encourage councillors to raise that so that we can make sure that we continue to drive the standards up. In terms of improving pedestrian movement, that's a very key element of the B-lines approach that's talked about within the report. So one of the things that Chris has been particularly keen to work with us on, and he's brought some additional advice in that has really been excellent in terms of helping to develop some thinking with local highway authorities, is around how we reduce the community severance that's brought about by our highway system around Greater Manchester, and we're actually looking to deliver considerably more pedestrian crossing facilities around the conurbation so that we can link neighbourhoods up effectively through to local key centres of activity. So one of the barriers at the moment for people not walking as regularly round to the local shop, for example, not walking down to the local rail station, is the difficulty of crossing the road, and we've got to address that, and we've got to have an expanded programme of pedestrian crossing measures to help with that. That's a key element of the programme, and it's one of the areas of spending that local authorities are now looking at as part of the Mayor's Cycling and Walking Fund. So hopefully we'll see some real improvements in that regard.
Well, if you have a working group on that, I'd like to be part of that, because I think there are things missing that I've seen and it's happened to me. And I don't think it's all been addressed at all. And this is why I'm being devil's advocate. On top of that, there are people out there that can't afford bikes. And they haven't been considered at all, especially on your estates.
Yeah, and again, that's a really good observation. So in terms of working groups, the proposals that we're working on are all being generated by individual local authorities, because we want to make sure that the solutions are driven by local issues. So I can only encourage councillors to kind of get involved within your local authority. Affordability is an issue. So there are various initiatives that we have underway there. We support the activities of a number of charities involved in bike recycling schemes, and that's allowed us to both deal with the waste issue associated with people who are moving on to a new bike, and also then to provide really cost-effective bikes for lower income households. We've got involved in bike loan schemes that have helped people who are getting back into work to take a bike but not face undue costs when they're coming back into work. So there are a series of initiatives out there, because there is no doubt that there are community benefits, there are public health benefits to us offering the opportunity for more people to be able to cycle, and clearly we don't want income to be the barrier for them being able to do that.
Councillor Walker. You're happy. Very good. One question from me: when I saw the Beeline's press release and communications come out, I couldn't quite tell what happened at the boundary of Greater Manchester, because it looked like there were lots of plans and then you cross the county lines or whatever it is and that's it. There's no longer cycling provision. Could you just flesh that out a bit for me?
Yeah, that's the next level of development now. So initially the exercise focused within local authority boundaries, and we looked to address issues of community severance as I described before. What we're now doing is refining through the consultation exercise that's underway at the moment the nature of those maps, and now starting to deal with both cross-boundary issues within Greater Manchester and also the relationship to outside.
Good, thank you very much. Nobody else has indicated, so thank you for that discussion. We're moving on to item 7, introduction of a zonal fare structure of the Metrolink network for a second month on the run. So we have had the conclusion of the focused period of public engagement, and you're bringing a report back on what happened there. So please feel free to briefly introduce it, because we have all read the papers. Promise.
Okay, so thank you, Chair. This report follows the report that went to the CA in May and came to this committee last month, and also it's important to note follows a presentation that I gave to the TF-GMC MRN committee. It summarises the proposal, which is a summary of the prior report, and then it sets out the approach to and the results of the public engagement activity. So really pulling out a couple of key points, it sets out the approach that we took to raise awareness of the public engagement, which I know, Chair, was something that you raised last month. So it sets out that we, through our own channels and through paid channels, went sort of best endeavours approach to making sure that we engage with as wide a section of the population of Greater Manchester and Metrolink users as possible. 99% of respondents to the survey use Metrolink on a regular basis. So it's important to say that the response to the survey was driven by that kind of ongoing engagement with Metrolink. The general response to the survey across all the elements was positive, so we asked people about their ease of understanding of the proposal, whether they thought it was more or less convenient compared to the current fare structure, and their perception on value for money. Across the ease of understanding, about 70% of respondents said that they found it easy to understand. Convenience, a similar number, around 2/3 said that they found it more convenient than the current fare structure. The response to the value for money proposition was more mixed. In general, people conflated the pre-agreed fare increase, which was scheduled for January 2019, with the Metrolink zonal proposal. And just in regard of that, paragraph 8.19 sets out that 78.5% of fares under the zonal proposal are lower than they would have been in January 2019 under the current fare structure. Which I think is important to note, as it shows that empirically this proposal does offer customers and the residents of Greater Manchester better value for money, despite that fairly mixed response to the value for money question in the survey. So happy to take any questions that you may have.
So in 8.1, where you talk about 4,981 surveys were completed and there were 1,369 partial responses, does that strike you as normal or within expected ranges for a consultation of this sort? And so my question, I guess, is was there something wrong with the consultation that meant people couldn't finish it or chose not to finish it, or is that normal?
So I think both in terms of the overall response rate and the number of partial responses, it's consistent with other engagement activities that we have conducted recently. Yes.
And I was pleased to see in the confusion and misunderstanding, which seem to fit into two buckets, so those who live in outer zones or on the border between two zones, their lack of understanding was higher than from other respondents. That there was a plan to address that lack of understanding by putting staff in person at tram stops rather than just doing it online, which I thought was a very good and sensible approach. Any questions or comments? Councillor Gunther.
First of all, I wouldn't ever dream of driving into Manchester. I always use the metro, always. Okay. However, when I worked in Manchester, I used to buy a contract, and under the terms of the contract, I could go anywhere. Well, then it was Bury to Altrincham. I could go anywhere within under the zonal scheme. Would that still? Well, number one, are weekly or monthly contracts still available? And number two, does that still apply? If you buy a contract, you can go anywhere. But if you have a zonal scheme, then presumably you pay to go within the zone you're in, that you've paid for. Yeah?
So absolutely, the proposal has been put together off the back of years of customer contact, which basically says that a system which allows you to travel on any product, whether it be a single product or a monthly product or an annual product, between 2 points on the network, doesn't work for a lot of people. It doesn't work for people who want to work in the city but want to access wider areas of Greater Manchester for leisure opportunity. It doesn't work for people who might have to work in multiple locations. So absolutely, we feel that introducing the flexibility of use of Metrolink through zones, where if you bought a 4-zone ticket covering the 4 proposed zones, you would be able to travel anywhere on the network. then it does resolve that problem for a lot of people and make Metrolink a more attractive proposition.
But you would have to buy a full zone ticket. You couldn't, I mean, it wouldn't be a bonus that if you bought a contract you could go anywhere. You would have to buy a full zone ticket.
So under the proposal there are 10 options, so there are 10 zonal fare options. So you could, for example, buy a ticket which just covered the city centre, zone 1. You could buy a ticket which covers zones 1 and 2, which would allow you to travel anywhere in those zones, right through to the 4-zone ticket, which would cover the entire network. So it gives customers that choice. Yeah.
Councillor Walker and then Councillor Wilson. Councillor Walker.
It seems to me, I mean, I like what you've done, and I like how you've tried to deal with the boundary issue, because that's always the crunch one. And there's a second boundary, isn't there? But that's life. There isn't a perfect answer to any of this. But unfortunately, when it first comes in, everyone will ignore the fact that we were committed already to a fare increase, and it will be down to this. And I think we just have to recognise that, and at least have statements, very, very clear, simple payment statements for the press and the media, because people will want to blame this system. And it feels absolutely right to me, but that doesn't matter. The public want to blame something for those increases, and they'll use this.
Go ahead.
So, as I mentioned, one of the key things that came out of the engagement exercise was that misconception and conflating the agreed fare rises with the zonal proposal. And what we've taken from that is that there is a very clear need, and this has been reinforced by discussions we've had with other stakeholders who have changed fare structures, so in the North East, for example, and their advice has been that you need to start your comms campaign well in advance of implementation, and then also going back to the Chair's earlier comment, you need people on the stop to help customers through the transition for a period of 1, 2, 3 months beyond that point of implementation.
Thank you. I've got Councillor Wilson, please.
You partly answered my question about comms. What I was also going to ask though is what is this now a done deal in terms of the introduction, and if not, what levels of approval does it need to go through, and if so, what are the timescales?
So the May 2018 paper to the CA requested approval in principle subject to the public engagement exercise. A follow-up report is going to the CA on the 27th of this month, which summarises the results of the public engagement exercise and requests final approval. In terms of timescale, it's currently scheduled in for, if it is approved, for implementation in early 2019. The timing of that, which has impacted the length of the public engagement activity, as was referenced last month, is to do with at the back end of this year we are introducing contactless payment on Metrolink, and in order for, if the zonal proposal and the development work required to implement the zonal proposal goes ahead, in order for it to be cost effective and then to deliver an incremental and coherent package of kind of fares and ticketing improvements for Metrolink customers, it makes sense to do it in early 2019.
Councillor Robinson.
Thank you, Chair. A few points. Firstly, where you're going to have these different zones, I making a suggestion if you're not going to do it, but every station that's zone 4, there is a zone 4 sign. Zone 3, every station should have zone 3 on it, right the way into the town centre. And people then will know what they have to pay for when they get to that particular station. But also to check that your machines are working, because I was late for a meeting in Manchester early last week. I had to be here for 9 o'clock in the morning. The money just kept falling out of the machine. It wasn't being accepted. One of the porters that was cleaning up at the time, not a station officer, a cleaner, came up and said, "Oh, that one's always not working, try the other one." We went, and one had been taken away. We had 4 originally in Bury, there's 3. that wasn't working. There was a lady at the other one, so I had to run round the back to try and get that one working. I missed my train, and I was late for my meeting. So you must check that when people have to pay for their tickets, the machines are in proper working order. And also, just to be devil's advocate again, it took me 2 hours to get here today on the Rochdale Metro line. But that's another story I'll tell you about.
Thank you, Councillor, and apologies for the journey here today on behalf of TFGM and Metrolink. So, firstly, on the first point about having the relevant zone on each stop, absolutely, that is something that we will consider. We have not yet decided exactly what the collateral on each stop would be. We intend to engage with customers to give them input into how they think we can best communicate. And absolutely, as part of that, I'd encourage all of you, if you have ideas like that, to submit them to myself and to TFGM. On your second point about TVMs, we do absolutely accept that sort of over the past year or so, TVM reliability has not been good enough. It's due to a number of issues. We have had high instances of vandalism with TVMs, spates of vandalism. The reliability of the machines is not great, and indeed our relationship with the supplier of the TVMs and their response to fixing them hasn't been appropriate. It has improved. I was in a meeting this morning where it was shown sort of that it is markedly improved in the last 2 to 3 months. However, it's still not at the level we'd like it to be at, but we're working with Keolis Amy, the Metrolink operator, with the supplier of TVMs to improve that situation at all times. I think also something that we could do better, and we are working to do, is to communicate alternatives to customers. That won't be appropriate for everybody, I accept that, but for example, the Get Me There app, customers can use that to purchase tickets. It's more convenient for some people than using the TVMs. If a proportion of customers use that method, it reduces queues at TVMs for everybody else. So we are aware of it and we're working to improve it.
Chair, just to add as well that if Councillor Robinson wants to talk to me afterwards, we'll get to the bottom of why he had such a bad journey today for you.
Thank you for that. I suspect she may take you up on that offer, Simon. Okay, thank you for this. It's good to read an update of where things have got to in the past month. I think I can probably speak on behalf of this committee in saying that coming to us before a decision is taken is a good thing and should be encouraged, particularly when it's a big transport decision, and we would welcome pre-decision scrutiny in good course, and we would always try to accommodate such a decision on the agenda. So thank you very much for that. Okay, Anne, we've missed you. Greater Manchester Spatial Framework, item 8. Would you like to introduce the paper?
Thank you, Chair. It's lovely to be back. Very quickly, it's quite a brief report, but possibly quite significant. You would all be aware we were due to go out to consultation at the end of this month. I probably would be looking slightly tireder were that the case. But what the report sets out is the decision that leaders and GMCA took at the end of last month to actually push that consultation back to October. The reason for that is that we had some new subnational population projections published by the government at the end of May. These come every 2 years, so we're always expecting them, and we can't always have the more stable situation. We don't stop consultation just because new information's come out, but these were perhaps more significant than we were expecting. They're showing still significant growth across Greater Manchester of nearly 250,000 people by 2036, but a 15% reduction in the growth that the last projections, which were published in 2014, were showing. On the basis of that, we feel that we need to really consider what the implications of that may be, because they are a very key input into the methodology we use to calculate the amount of housing we should be providing for over the GMSF period. We'll not be in a position to really know what that figure should look like until the subnational household projections, which come out of the population projection. So we have a certain number of population, and it's what their propensity to form households will be. They come out in September. So we're still working very hard and trying to get a draft plan and doing all of that work, but we will need to just look and see what those figures show us come September, and then be taking the draft GMSF to the Combined Authority at the end of October. I think it goes without saying there will be the need for fewer households than last time, so it is quite significant. The other item that I was just raising, last committee I was at, which I know wasn't the last committee, there was quite a discussion around the communications and messaging for the next plan. So I was just trying to share with you some of the work that our comms colleagues have been doing, looking at what those messages would be, what their campaign is likely to focus around in the lead up to the consultation, because we're trying to get information out before the consultation so people know it's coming. I think last time it landed and nobody was expecting it, and it didn't land as a welcome surprise, I think it was fair to say. So we're trying to address those issues, and more critically perhaps, we had a lot of criticism that the consultation portal, the online portal we used, was really difficult to use. People couldn't access it or couldn't find their way around it. So we've changed the provider of that. We have a new platform which is called Citizen Space. I've put some links to some live consultations that are currently ongoing using Citizen Space. It's a web-based portal, a lot easier, I think, a lot more intuitive to use. Stockport have just finished a consultation on their local plan using Citizen Space. So if you want to have a look at that and let me know whether or not you think it is easier to use, we're going to move to that system. Hopefully then people will find it more accessible.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Anne. And I had a look at, I looked in some detail at the Eastleigh Borough local plan, so it was really useful to give us some live examples. And I thought the language they used in particular was really clear and very straightforward. There wasn't the jargon that can sometimes creep in. And so I would welcome that. I wonder if you could just flesh out a little bit under 4.2, where it talks about the range of activity keeping the spatial framework in the public eye. So this is before the consultation. You talked there about some of the ways that might happen. I wonder if you could just flesh that out a bit. So if I were not a councillor, if I were a regular person, what would I see and how would I see it?
Yeah, I've done it for many years and I still can't remember. We're looking to, I think, use a range of methods. So we are looking for some people to be writing blogs that will go into sort of the press online and that talk about why this is a good idea, or from their perspective what they want to see out of this. We will be using social media quite a lot. We've got quite a big database of people who've said they want to be kept up to date on news. We'll be sending newsletters out. So that will all be happening. It's unfortunate we've got August. We're probably likely to start that in September, I think, because we want to miss the school holidays if we can. But there will be a range of material, and if people want to register on the website to make sure that they don't miss out on anything, they can do that. But equally, if you follow the GMCA Twitter, which I'm sure you all do, religiously, that there will be updates on Twitter, there will be newsletters that go out sort of from the consultation database that we have. So there's a range of activities that will be taking place. It would be useful to get views on whether or not they're reaching a certain section of the population and not everyone, and if not, how we might address getting a wider range of people involved. We're doing work with the comms colleagues around working with young people, so the Youth Combined Authority, and how we might get into younger people, and doing work with the Ageing Hub about how we sort of get messages out to sort of our network of groups across Greater Manchester that are dealing with ageing. But any suggestions you have to help with that would be welcome.
Councillor Robinson.
Thank you, Chair. I've been attending another group discussing the spatial framework and what have you, and the Paul Dennett is doing the listening group that's going round all of the authorities, and I know it's coming to Rochdale pretty soon. We've redone our analysis on after the combined one was done, and we found that in Rochdale actually we're going to be spiking like that, whereas we're going to be in demand for houses, where in other places there's not going to be the demand that they thought there was going to be. So we've already assessed that we will suddenly have a spike up where we will need the properties, and we're already sort of above what we'd planned to do with regards to housing. There was something else, but I can come back on that.
Very quickly on the population projections, you're right, there are 43,000 people predicted, fewer people, but that isn't evenly spread across Greater Manchester. So Oldham and Rochdale are predicted or forecast to grow faster than they were, and Wigan and Bury have very, very significant reductions in their growth. So Manchester, Salford, roughly the same. So it isn't the same across the whole of GM.
Councillor Morgan.
Just a comment, really, Chair. Obviously, don't welcome the pushing back, but we do welcome the report because hopefully it will have a positive effect on the amount of houses that we'll need across the whole of Greater Manchester. And it's really just commenting that we hope that the Mayor will continue to put brownfield first, and by definition then will result in saving more of the green belt land around Greater Manchester. Would that be a fair comment?
I think very happy to tell you that he will be continuing to put brownfield first, particularly I think obviously in town centres. You know, the town centre challenge is really trying to sort of generate and galvanise sort of that market and interest in the town centres, and that is all part of looking to minimise and reduce the amount of green belt and other green space in the urban area that we need to build on.
Okay, Councillor Walker.
Yes. Again, on this housing projection, because Wigan's the worst of all. I'm calling it worst, but it feels worst because clearly one of the issues that we've all got are resisting planning applications that are not in keeping with how we see our futures. And the worst of all scenarios is actually to have empty new houses lying around. But the pressure is that no one wants to build the dearer ones. The brownfield sites that have just been mentioned are nearly always the dearest to develop. You know, because there's loads of extra costs involved. In our case, a lot of it's mining subsidence, for instance. And I just wonder whether there's any extra advice that will be coming out. I mean, we're discussing it locally already. I'm a member of the planning committee at Wigan, but it is a real worry because of this pressure on actually forget brownfield. I don't want it. I want the easy walk on, drive straight off the road, not much infrastructure, and that's almost the opposite of what we're trying to do to get sustainable development.
I think quickly it is probably the biggest problem that we face is how do we get brownfield land coming forward quicker than we currently have. That's been behind a lot of the discussions we've had with government around the housing package and trying to negotiate some sort of land fund to pay for remediation. Those discussions are still ongoing. I think from a planning perspective, I know Bolton have just had 2 or 3 planning applications at their planning committee in the last couple of weeks that they've refused on, I think, protected open land. The reason that you struggle to do that, as you know, is that you haven't got a 5-year housing land supply. Part of what we're trying to do by doing this together at Greater Manchester is to strengthen that position so we do have that 5-year supply, because that's the easiest way to say to somebody, they might not still want to develop brownfield, but it makes it much, much harder for them to make the case for greenfield or greenbelt. So that collectively what we're trying to do is really look at that land supply and say, how can we demonstrate that we've got at least 5 years of land that is available, that is viable. We might underwrite some of that, we might, but that's one of the key drivers. And in doing that, then we can resist much more effectively the green belt, the greenfield development. But it is a really, really difficult position.
Can I just say, you weren't here when we had the discussion about the rail problems, but they actually make this worse. Because no, because one of the dilemmas that you've got is that people, to be honest, quite a lot of people will come to Wigan because the housing is less expensive for the same lump of property than it is in Stockport, for instance. And it's a real, we've undermined that. It's difficult because Northern and even Network Rail don't really, I mean, they care about it, but they don't care as passionately as we do about what's happening in our own areas. And if you undermine why people should come to reasonable priced housing, because you undermine it, if they can't rely on that decent rail network, you know, then they're thinking, well, no, I'm not going to chance that. I'll fight my corner in Trafford or wherever it is. And it is an absolute dilemma for us, and it undermine, you know, it really does undermine the strategy for having a Greater Manchester wide, you know, argument about the spatial framework. Clearly, I mean, this is going to go again to the leaders, and it's a very political question, but actually it's really fundamental to a lot of us and what's happening in our boroughs. This isn't just about resisting, and particularly this brownfield site thing, I can see that we're going to have brownfields still sat idle, and next to it, you know, the green belt is yet again built on, because we can't resist. We've got a core strategy, you know, that we're keen on, and we're flogging, but unfortunately, builders ease off. They take the foot off the gas when they see any of these indicators. Life's just easier for them, but when I see a 53% difference, it's frightening.
Councillor Gunther.
Right. Well, I absolutely agree with what Councillor Walker has said. About virgin land, and so there's nothing more attractive to a builder than a virgin site where he's not going to encounter, you know, contamination or all the other things. But the issue I would want to bring up is empty homes. I know in Bury we've got about 3,000, and really I think effort needs to, perhaps more effort, needs to be put into bringing these back into operation. But the other thing I would just mention on a more jocular point of view, and we are quite selfish about our lovely little town, and I do notice the reduction in population, but you know, we are quite nice and we are quite friendly in Bury.
So I'm right in saying it's not a reduction in population, it's a reduction in growth projections. Okay.
Fair enough.
So people are not fleeing Bury. That's not what this report says, is my understanding. Did you want to come back on that, Anne?
I mean, that is right. We are still forecasting growth everywhere. It's just at a slower pace in most places, apart from Oldham and Rochdale, where it is a little bit faster.
Yeah.
Sorry. I'm not an expert on many things. Well, it is, and I'm part of the planning and housing team. We have been doing a lot of work over the last few years on empty homes, and again, at a Greater Manchester level, the number of empty homes has reduced dramatically. We're at quite a low percentage. I think for a functioning housing market, you would normally have about 3% empty homes, because you need homes that are empty because they're often, you know, as people are moving and whatever. And we're actually getting quite close to that and below that in some places. But again, there are discrepancies across different districts. So I'm not sure what the Bury situation is, but it is something that certainly Paul Dennett, City Mayor, is very keen that, you know, we look at all of those things that make places nice places to live and not so nice places, and I think having a lot of derelict empty homes is not conducive to an attractive neighbourhood. So I can check what the Bury statistics are for you and get back to you, but it is something. We had an empty homes programme, I think that's now finished. Councils putting up council tax on empty homes had a huge impact on people starting to bring them back into use, and we saw quite a significant increase there. So from my perspective, I thought we were actually at quite a low level, but I can check that out.
And I think just for Councillor Gunther's information, you weren't a member of the committee when we talked a little bit about empty homes back in November of last year under the Greater Manchester Housing Affordability item that Councillor Robinson will remember. And we talked specifically about some of the work that's being done to bring some of these empty homes back into use. But it's an important item, but not necessarily one that Anne's here to talk about today. Councillor Robinson, you indicated.
Yeah, as part of that, I've been on this other group dealing with Paul Dennett's strategy on the housing side and the empty homes. I'm also over this for the Borough of Rochdale, and we have a target that we have done about bringing some of our empty properties back into use, and over the last few years we have actually brought a number of properties back into use. We also use the CPO if we have rogue landlords that don't play ball or do their properties up or don't even live in the country anymore. And we've set some bit of money on one side just to deal with CPOs on empty properties that have been empty for a long time. It's been successful so far because some landlords just can't afford to do them up. Other landlords aren't interested anymore. Other landlords, it's been passed on through the family. So we're finding various ways why these properties have been left. But that's what we're using, CPO on empty properties. But we're also using it obviously on business land as well. So that's one way forward, and I'm the lead on that. So if she wants any more information, I can meet her another time and give her the further information that I've got.
We're linking up across the table.
Yeah.
Lovely, thank you very much. Councillor Morgan.
It's just a comment, really, and it's got confirmation. We've had quite a lot of discussion in Bolton about empty houses contributing to the housing supply, and we were informed that bringing an empty house property back in does not contribute to the new housing numbers. Is that right?
It is right. Because it already exists, so their net increases, and it's good to bring them in, but it doesn't. No.
Okay, I've taken every indication that somebody had a question or a comment, so I think I'll wrap that up. Thank you very much indeed, Anne. One question actually before we release you into the night. The timing of the next time you come here, have you got any thoughts on whether you'd like to come to this committee? Well, not whether you'd like to, whether it might be appropriate for you to come to this committee before the release of the consultation?
I'm happy to come in October, in September and October, because I think we did agree we would keep updated if you still want that. I'm not sure quite how much information I'll be able to give at some of those meetings, but I'm more than happy to come, and then we can, provide whatever information I can. But I think I have suggested to Susan on the work plan, although I got my months wrong, that we have a very substantive item in November when we actually do go through the draft plan at that point. So happy to attend the meetings.
Thank you on behalf of the committee for that, and I think we'll come on to work programme shortly, but I think that would make a lot of sense that we give this item the space it needs and the space it deserves to really go into, and you could bring however many and whichever colleagues you feel it will be appropriate to bring. I think please keep us updated. If a briefing note is appropriate, please drop in a briefing note. If something more substantial is happening, please do come along and work with Susan on whether it would be appropriate for you to come along. But thank you very much for that. Okay, item 9, register of key decisions. Members are just asked to note that you should be circulated this register as a member of this committee anyway. Work programme, item 10. So we are partway through now our second municipal year, and so we are coming back to some items that we have already covered and that we want to add into this programme. There was an outline in your papers, but I note the absence of rough sleeping on there. That was an item that we spent some time on in the last municipal year, and we made some recommendations to the combined authority, which my understanding was they agreed with thoroughly. And so having an update on that, I think, would be really useful.
There's another meeting coming up of the rough sleeping with Andy Burnham next week, and I'm going to that one.
You're going to that, Councillor Robinson, that's good to know. But I think this committee, as the scrutiny committee for homelessness and rough sleeping as a part of that, I think we'd like to be kept up to date, wouldn't we, and to move that forwards. So that, I think, should be on there. I think buses should come. I'm personally reasonably relaxed about when they come, but I think there's on time, regularly and on time. As an item to this committee, I think there is work being done on the future of buses across Greater Manchester, and so I think somewhere there should be an item on that in the coming months. I'm looking at
My scribbles, do you want me to translate?
Please, would you kindly translate, Susan?
Okay, I have been in touch with colleagues from TFGM about the appropriate time for buses, and we think it's going to be October, we think, but obviously it's a slightly movable feast, and we'll, sort of amend the work programme with your permission accordingly. Anne is down to do an item. It's not Anne, it should be Mia Crowther. Sorry, Anne. So in August, I can't do my months now. In August, there was some thought about, the way in which transport colleagues plan in accordance with what the requirements of the spatial framework. So that was something that was offered up to you. And I think in particular in informal discussions with members, we've talked about maybe also the sequencing of transport delivery, which seems to everybody to be quite straightforward and, well, an important thing, not straightforward at all. The other item, we've been contacted by colleagues from Waste, and obviously in your meeting last month, we talked about the procurement of waste. Now, the actual technical stuff to do with the procurement, the procurement process goes to a different committee. Yeah. That's about overseeing the procurement. However, David did suggest that maybe the technical solutions proposed by some of the suppliers might be good for this committee to look at, because that's all about delivering the requirements of Greater Manchester's waste strategy. So we're working with colleagues. We think that's likely to be in September.
Thank you for that. And if any member of the committee would like an item to be considered for inclusion, please do get in touch with Susan. If you've got something that you think it's within the remit of this committee, we absolutely should be looking at it. Let's work out where and when might be appropriate. Okay, item 11, date and time of next meeting, Thursday the 16th of August at 10:30 a.m. Thank you very much, everybody. See you then.